Today's Ancient DOS game is going to blow a lot of minds, as this is a game often forgotten by DOS gaming enthusiasts since it wasn't ever completed and was never originally intended to be released to the public. That game being Transland. And just to clarify before we go any further, I believe the trans part of the title is in reference to the word transmission, given the story of the game, but I could be wrong. But yeah, this game was actually the result of an internal development exercise by a particular game developing studio who tasked some of their staff to come up with something as they learned how to do 3D game development at said company. Eventually, the project was set aside as the people who were working on this were set to task on actual projects that were intended for commercial release. Now, there were musings of potentially turning this game into a full-fledged commercial product, but as you're going to see as we dive into this, it would have needed a lot of work to bring it up to that point, as it's extremely rough around the edges. After some time had passed, the developers decided instead to just dump this game in its unfinished state into a part of their website dedicated to quote-unquote fun stuff, and it basically just sat there for others to find. No announcements, no fanfare. That's why it didn't get widespread recognition and nearly disappeared forever once said developer closed its doors in the early 2000s. The more interesting point, though, is that if you take this game at face value when you first download it, you're going to be missing a number of little extra bits, and even then, I'm positive there's more hiding here than I can figure out on my own accord. So I'm hoping that by the end of this video, some of the more technically inclined amongst you might find a way to unlock some of the greater mysteries surrounding this thing. Yep, the mystery is finally revealed. The company responsible for this game is none other than Origin Systems, the same company responsible for creating the Ultima and Wing Commander games and for publishing the original System Shock. Now, while this was originally developed in 1994, they didn't upload it to their website for others to download until 1996, well after they decided they weren't going to return to this game to properly develop it. And again, it's all but disappeared along with Origin Systems, that's why it's so incredibly obscure nowadays. Also, I see this game often called a first-person shooter, but you don't actually do a whole lot of shooting in this game. Now, you do a ton of parkour, so I believe it's more apt to call this game a one-player first-person platformer. Now, it runs in the standard VGA 320x200 256 color mode and has support for both PC speaker and Sound Blaster sound effects. There's only a single PC speaker effect in the entire game, but that still technically qualifies. In fact, those of you already familiar with this thing may be surprised to learn it has sound support at all, but we'll get into that a bit later. Well, heck, the game probably supports more than just Sound Blaster sound, but that's the only mode I could figure out how to get working. As for its current release state, it was always freeware following its release, though most of the places which still even have this thing are all abandonware websites. Though thankfully, one fully legit site you can get this thing from is the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com. Suffice to say, there were never any physical release copies, so don't even bother trying to find one. There's a mock-up of a potential story when you first start the game, and it's kind of neat how it's presented as storyboard artwork instead of finished artwork, complete with arrows to show the pathing everything would have if it was properly animated. But basically, you play a character who saved up a whole bunch of cash to buy a spaceship on the cheap and explore the galaxy. But not too long into your flight, the spaceship goes poof, and you end up falling down to some unknown planet right in front of a tiny village with 3 people in it, living in houses of straw, wood, and brick. Kind of like the story of the 3 little pigs. However, these people are not pigs avoiding a wolf, rather they've lost contact with their friends and family as their transmission network is down, so they task you with finding some gear to help you out and to help them fix their network. But right off the bat, you're going to notice that the frame rate is incredibly inconsistent. Even nowadays, you still sometimes encounter a developer using frame-time games instead of real-time games, but back in the 90s, this was still way more common over real-time, just because of how much easier it was. However, because this 3D engine varies in computational complexity to extreme degrees, it's impossible to get it running at anything even remotely consistent. There'll be super fast moments, and there'll be ultra slow moments. It's just how it's gotta be, unfortunately. Now, the controls themselves aren't too bad, though they are slightly unusual. You use the arrow keys to move and turn, the A key is your fire button, the 1, 2, and 3 keys are used to look up, down, or centered, the shift key can be held down to turn more slowly with the arrows, spacebar is the jump key, once you have the ability to jump that is, and you hold Alt to strafe with the arrow keys, once you have the ability to strafe. Yeah, strafing is locked off by an optional power-up you can find. Go figure. Now, one thing which might not be obvious right away is that you can't fire your weapons up or down. No matter how far you look up or down, your shots always stay aligned with your current altitude. So to hit things in the air, you need to either jump and shoot, or find a way to get up to the same altitude. It's also important to note that water is deadly. If you end up inside water, your movement speed slows down and your health will sap away really quickly. Unfortunately, all death does is reset the level and you have infinite lives. So combined with how small most of the levels are, death is just a minor inconvenience really. The village is sort of the hub world, as small as it is, and branches off to 3 other places, including a hedge maze, a strange place filled with fans which can blow you into the air, and a fairly large area filled with ice, snow, and sharks. Now the hedge maze is your first stop, and while this isn't a very large maze, it does have some giant acid-spitting plants to worry about, which take a lot of hits to defeat. Now you'll also likely find your first energy power-ups here for refilling your health, and will immediately notice that they give a pitifully small amount of health back, enough to survive maybe 1 extra hit. The goal of the hedge maze is to acquire the jump unit, which allows you to jump either straight up, or with a burst of forward acceleration. And keeping in mind, you still have full movement control in the air, thus the forward jump is mostly just to assist in clearing gaps. Now this jump is actually high enough to clear a full cube of height, which means when you come back to the hedge maze later, you can just jump your way through it instead of actually having to path through it. The next area you visit is loaded with fans, which push you up into the ceiling. Now the important thing to note here is that the game doesn't let you move over top of areas which are not valid, so this entire fan area looks like it's precarious, but it's actually perfectly safe. You just have to hit a bunch of switches in the right order to get all the fans going, so that you can get up top, where you'll find the Ballistic Incinerator Grenade Gun, which has a limited ammo supply, but does much more damage than the gun you start with, and has significantly longer range, though not unlimited range. The last area you visit is the Ice World, and this is a rather large place that's sure to give you a lot of frustrations in terms of the platforming, combined with the inconsistent speed of the game. Really though, it's not too bad once you get used to it. Now at the end of all of this, you acquire the panel remover, which is needed to open all 5 of the transmission boxes throughout the game, with there being 1 box in most areas and 2 boxes in the village. In fact, the transmission box for the Ice World is very close to where you pick up the panel remover, so it's a good idea to go for it straight away before teleporting back to the village. Well, that's something that's important to note, is that the game allows you to teleport to any area you've been to once before at any time, and the state of each area is remembered to some extent. The power-ups and enemies will return, and non-critical things may reset, but there are also global things, like the transmission boxes, which retain their state, plus other quality of life shortcuts may appear later on as well. And yeah, once you have the panel remover, the final goal of the game is to activate the connections in all 3 of the levels, activate the power in the village, and then activate the network in the village, and that's it. No fancy fanfare, just some messages of thanks from the village's inhabitants. Heck, you can even go shut the power back off and the villagers will be right back to telling you to go turn it on like you hadn't actually beaten the game yet. So that's the basic extent of the game itself, but now it's time to dive into this game's secrets. Seeing that this was never finished, nor intended for public release, it should come as no surprise that there's certain things you can do with this game which aren't mentioned anywhere in the accompanying readme or in the game itself. Firstly, let's address the sound, as it probably came as a surprise for any of you who've played this before that there even is sound in this game, or rather, that it's actually possible to get the sound effects working. Now, while searching for downloads of this game online, I found a total of 4 which were working. Now, out of all 4 of them, none of them were configured properly to have the sound function on their DOSBox. Now, since there's no setup program and no auto detection, you have to alter the config details for the sound manually, but upon opening the sound.cfg file, it's not going to be immediately obvious what all the values are. Well, heck, I'm still not sure what the first value is, though I suspect the second value is S to indicate Sound Blaster support, as I believe there are other supported devices, but again, I have no idea how to get them to initialize. The next value is the port value, which you'd think would be 220, except it's stored here as a decimal value. Now, since the number 220 doesn't have any letters in it, it's easy to forget that 220 is a hexadecimal port value. Now, converted to decimal, this should be 544. The next value is a DMA channel to use, and the last value is the IRQ, both of which should be set to match your DOSBox configuration, or the actual configuration for your hardware on a real computer. However, even after all of that, the sound still isn't going to work, because you have to launch the game with a command line parameter S. Not -S, not /S, just S, all by itself. Now you'll have sound effects, but not music. Unfortunately, the music was never included with the original download. However, there is a file, midilist.txt, which lists all the MIDI files used by name. So that's a starting point at least if you want to add your own MIDI music in yourself. Another thing you may notice if you look at the batch file which runs the game is it calls the executable with the I command line parameter. So what happens if you run the game without this parameter? Well, it puts the game in a weird sort of debugging mode, which skips the intro sequence, gives you all of the collectible items right off the bat, doesn't give you a status bar, and also permits infinite jumping. Now, this isn't exactly a debugging mode per se, but I'll have more thoughts on this in a moment. The gameplay itself has a couple secrets too. If you press the P key, you'll bring up a special raycasting map, revealing that the game is indeed using some form of raycasting to do its thing. Though, given that you can look nearly straight up and straight down without any distortion, I think it's only using raycasting for determining what to render, and is doing the rendering itself using a different method. You can also hit the V key to bring up a cheat system, which allows you to alter various flags and variables. However, this cheat system assumes you already know what all of the values are supposed to be, or can be, so altering this stuff is kind of a shot in the dark. Which is unfortunate because there's one more secret hiding within this thing which I was unable to get working and might be triggered using this cheat system. A built-in level editor. I scanned through the executable file with a hex editor and noticed raw text explaining how to use some of its editor components. So there's clearly a level editor hiding within this executable. Now, further proof of this is the existence of a tranedit.cfg file, which has considerably more values which don't mean a whole lot, yet are probably really important. Alas, this also kind of shows that in order to use the editor, it might be necessary to have properly configured folders and raw files which weren't included with the public release. Like, heck, looking through the map list that was included, it seems that there's a bunch of testing levels that weren't included here. So, despite the executable being capable of editing levels, it may no longer be possible without some extreme reverse engineering of how this game works. However, I did notice one last curiosity. Even though the game takes place over the course of only 4 maps, there's 5 map files included. Now when you boot the game, any command line parameter not recognized is converted into a decimal value, which tries to load the map file indicated by a listing entry in the maplist.txt file, with 0 equal to the first entry, 1 equal to the second, 2 to the third, and so on. Now, I determined that the included map file that wasn't used in normal gameplay was test1.map. So I put that into the map list as the first entry, loaded up the game with a command line parameter of 0, and voila! One of the game's testing levels. As you can see, there's not too much going on here, but it definitely serves as a good demonstration that this engine might be a little more complex than it seems on the surface. Now remember, this was mid-90s, so all kinds of shortcuts needed to be taken to get polygonal textured 3D to render at any sort of reasonable frame rate. And unlike nowadays with our Radeon and GeForce cards, where you can arbitrarily toss a million textured polygons at them in HD resolution and still get a frame rate of 60. It's kind of unfair to give an overall assessment of a game which was never actually finished, but I do have to say, Transland definitely gives me the impression of people learning to do commercial quality 3D gaming, and that was exactly what this was intended to do. In fact, the way this engine plays and the way it's based on cubes makes me feel like System Shock's engine might have been directly devised from this one. In which case, yeah, Transland led to System Shock, meaning it served an exceptionally important role in Origin's history, even if only indirectly. Suffice to say, you can't leave cycles set to max, otherwise this thing's gonna go way too fast. I found 20,000 cycles to be a good balance between the highest frame rates and the lowest frame rates, though you can adjust that as per your own tastes. Also, every download I found of this game defaulted the Sound Blaster IRQ to 5. But since you're likely going to have to fix the port value from 220 to 544 anyways, you might as well just alter the IRQ to DOSBox's default Sound Blaster IRQ of 7 while you're at it, rather than changing that in the DOSBox config file. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday on ADG Pro, we're going to take a look back at a game which features a fictional language used throughout, to see if we can decipher it, and then use it to discover what interesting messages were being hidden in plain sight. So be sure to stay tuned as we check that out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.